Yeah, so just before the break, we were talking about change. So we're talking about how change isn't always welcome when it first arrives, but that if we can adapt to it, if we can go through some of the fear, some of the loss, find a place of stillness with it, then very often we find ourselves in a new place of engagement. We find new things to do, new things we can contribute. And that's a really, really important thing to keep in mind, that change actually gives us an opportunity. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is those times when change isn't good. So there are times where we just know that change is hard. So when psychologists have tried to look at what are the factors that make change a difficult thing, they come up with a number of different things. So firstly, they say change is difficult when it's unexpected. So you couldn't see it coming. You didn't know it was about to occur. You didn't know this was going to be demanded of you. It just comes out of nowhere. Sometimes those are the kind of changes that actually lead us to feel a little bit resentful. Maybe it's been imposed on us by somebody else, or we kind of feel like they've come as a bit of a shock to our system and they take a bit of adapting to. We also tend to not be particularly happy when change is uncontrollable, in the sense that we haven't had any kind of say in it. We've got no agency in it whatsoever. A few years back, I found myself lying in the X-ray department of Lincoln County Hospital. And as I was lying there, I was about to be X-rayed for some kind of chest pains I was having. Don't worry, it was no big problem. But I was about to be X-rayed for those kind of things. And as I was lying there in huge pain, I heard a family next to me having a conversation in which a young man was gradually going down and down and down, looking more and more depressed. And his mum, who I assumed to be his mum, an elder lady, was saying to him, "It wasn't your fault, it wasn't your fault." And the more she said it, the more depressed he looked. And so I'm lying there, and I wrote my doctorate in road traffic accidents, so I'm listening in on this kind of conversation, wondering, what's going on here then? And I begin to piece together that he'd had some kind of big crash, some kind of big accident, and he'd been hit. It was nothing to do with his bad driving, it was the other person. But one of the things I knew from the research that I'd done is that sometimes it's harder to deal with a change like that. If it isn't your fault, it means you weren't in control. It could happen again. It means life is a bit chaotic. And so there I am lying in pain, and I turn to him and the family, and I give them a moment of ad hoc therapy about, actually, you know what? Sometimes it's harder when you're not responsible. Sometimes it's harder when it isn't your fault. And weirdly, he just looked up and gave me a little smile and just said, yeah, you're absolutely right. That's exactly what I'm struggling with. So sometimes changes that we can't control, they come as an interruption, they're unexpected, we're not responsible for them, are difficult. Sometimes changes are unusual. So sometimes changes come our way that not only did we not expect or we didn't have any control, but also we just think they're odd and other people won't understand them. Perhaps if we're diagnosed with an illness and other people weren't there when the diagnosis took place, or maybe we go through a divorce and other people don't quite understand what went on in the relationship, those moments can be difficult as well, because it's hard to convey exactly what occurred then. And sometimes changes are irreversible. So if you think about moving house, where people say we can never go back to where we were before because it's gone, or occasionally you hear people where their houses have been knocked down or they've been rendered inhospitable, can't be lived in, those kind of things, that makes it difficult. It's like we've had to change, we were forced into it, it couldn't be altered in that way. And especially it's difficult when changes are blameworthy. In other words, it's somebody else's fault, somebody else did this to us. So it's not unusual, for example, where families, perhaps they're in social housing, for example, and they're moved from one place to another, and they don't have a huge sense of agency about it, but they feel like this wasn't about us, this was somebody else, somewhere else made this decision, and we didn't have a say, and they go with a kind of begrudging approach to things. These are the kind of things that make change painful. And what happens when change is difficult like that is that we tend, as human beings, to process it in a particular way. So the first thing that happens is we try to make meaning of it. So think about families moving into new communities. Think about new communities trying to work together. To begin with, we're thinking, I can't make sense of this. What's going on? How does this work? And particularly if the change has been very difficult, or we don't like it, or we don't like where we've ended up, that attempt to make meaning of the change leads to a sense of anxiety. It's almost like the more we think about it, the more we ruminate and worry about it, the more anxious we become. And if we're becoming anxious about it, what that means is that sometimes we even want to avoid thinking about it. We want to avoid thinking about that kind of change, which means that we can't make sense of it, which means that it makes us more anxious, which means that we avoid it more, and so on and so forth. So that's when you talk to people who've been through deep stress or huge adversity, they sometimes say thinking about it is like having a thought on a bungee rope. You know, every time I throw it out, it comes back. It's like this thought has me, I don't have it. Some people would put it to me like this: it's like something's happened to me. It's like a file in my mind that doesn't fit on any particular shelf. It doesn't fit in the filing cabinets of my memory. I can't make sense of it. And so one of the things we can do in terms of helping people to get through change and begin to understand it is start to help them to process it, to think about how did this change come about, to create a story. So even in very traumatic changes, quite often one of the ways that clinical psychologists like me will work with people is to get them to write a story. Write a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, so that suddenly your change makes sense. Suddenly that thought that doesn't fit on any shelf in your mind is a story, and suddenly it fits, and suddenly it works. And that's one of the ways of building communities that have been through huge changes. How together do you allow those communities of people to begin not just to work out what they can contribute, but also to tell a story, a narrative, a way of beginning to give themselves an identity and a sense of ownership in what they are. So if you're going to talk about this section, one of the ways you might like to do that is to begin to think about how do you begin to help people to build a sense of community and identity, very often around what's the story of who we are and how we got here.